It is the waning years of the 16th century. Despite being nominally at peace since 1568, the borderlands of the Habsburg and Ottoman domains are still subject to constant raids and small-scale conflict. Given that this period of supposed peace between the two empires was commonly referred to as the Little War, it was clear that the resumption of large-scale military campaigns was ultimately inevitable. Although both empires had recently signed a 9-year peace treaty in 1591, any hope that it can be maintained was shattered in the summer of 1592, when the prospect of war became an imminent reality. Without a declaration of war, the Ottoman Beylerbey of Bosnia, Hasan Pasha, led an army of 20,000 Janissaries and attacked Croatia, laying siege to the fortress of Sisak. While the Croatians managed to repel the Ottomans, they were unable to prevent the capture of the crucial fortified border city of Bihać. Hasan Pasha again attempted to capture Sisak the following year, in 1593, with a force of around 15,000. This time, however, he was decisively defeated by a 5,000-strong Croatian, Slovenian, and German relief army. The Ottomans suffered nearly 8,000 casualties. Among those killed was Hasan Pasha himself, the Sultan's nephew Mehmed, and 6 other beys. When news of the defeat reached Constantinople, the Ottoman nobility, urged on by the Sultan's sister, called for war. Despite the attack being in direct violation of current Ottoman interests and policies, Sultan Murad III felt obliged to retaliate. He deemed the defeat far too embarrassing to ignore. Accordingly, Sultan Murad III declared war on the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, and the two superpowers of the era began preparing for a confrontation that would decide the fate of Central Europe for centuries to come. Thus, the long Turkish War had begun. Understanding the threats that the Ottomans posed to Christian dominance in Europe, Pope Clement VIII re-established the Holy League in 1594. It consisted of a series of military alliances between various European powers, all united under the goal of driving the Ottomans out of Europe once and for all. The coalition included both Catholic and Orthodox nations. Of its members, Wallachia, Transylvania, Moldavia, and the Serbs of Banat had all been formerly under Ottoman rule and were now in open rebellion. The Serb uprising, which had begun in March, had expected to receive more support from the Allies. When it failed to materialize, however, the rebellion was ultimately defeated by July of the same year. In terms of military objectives for the war, the Ottoman army looked to seize Vienna, while the Habsburgs aimed to unite their Hungarian territories. In support of their Austrian relatives, the Spanish Habsburgs dispatched a force of 6,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry from the Netherlands, under the command of Karl von Mansfeld. In January of 1595, Sultan Murad I died of natural causes. The situation quickly began to worsen for the Ottomans throughout the year. Forced to fight on 2 fronts, in Wallachia and Hungary, they suffered defeats against the likes of Mihai the Brave at Kalagoreni and Giurgiu, and at Esztergom against Karl von Mansfeld. These victories did not leave the Christian cause unscathed, however, as von Mansfeld was wounded during the siege and died shortly afterwards. As his replacement, Emperor Rudolf II appointed his own brother, the inexperienced Archduke of Austria, Maximilian III. However, despite this setback, the Austrian forces continued on to capture the castle of Hatvan in August of 1596. It is said that after the garrison had capitulated, every Ottoman, including women and children, was slaughtered by the Austrian troops. In the same month, the Ottomans launched a massive offensive under the personal command of the new Sultan himself, Mehmed III. Sources vary significantly on the size of the Ottoman force, with some putting the figure as high as 1 million. It is speculated that Mehmed III's army was larger than the host led by Suleiman the Magnificent 30 years prior, which had numbered around 100,000. As such, historians have generally estimated the figure to range anywhere from 100,000 to 150,000, in addition to 170 cannons. The Ottoman army of this period was in desperate need of modernization. Composed mostly of light cavalry, it is estimated that the infantry arm made up no more than 20% of the army's total fighting strength. It is also important to note that the army did not have any heavy cavalry. The only unit possessing firearms was an elite corps of 32,000 janissaries, with the rest of the army still being equipped with cold weapons. The Ottoman host moved slowly, not only due to its size, but also because the Sultan still hadn't determined the goal of the campaign. Upon reaching the Danube, he convened a war council with his commanders. Because the offensive had begun 3 months later than planned, they concluded that attacking Vienna was unfeasible this late in the campaigning season. Still with no military objective and unsure in which direction to take the army, some proposed besieging the castle of Komarome, arguing that its capture would secure the Danube frontier. However, many nobles opposed this suggestion, believing that the castle was too small and did not deserve to be besieged by the Sultan. After some debate, the council decided on a target more worthy of being captured by their leader. Thus, the Ottoman war machine began moving towards the important border fortress of Eger. Because of its location, Eger acted as one of the primary links between the allied Habsburg and Transylvanian lands. By capturing it, the Ottoman commanders looked to hinder the Allies' ability to effectively communicate and supply one another. Maximilian III, who was still encamped at Hatvan, managed to send a small detachment to reinforce the castle's garrison, raising the number of defenders to around 4,000. The Sultan's army arrived around Eger's walls around September 21st of 1596. Despite its importance and having just received reinforcements, the border fortress was gravely unprepared for a siege and had little hope of repelling the Ottoman tide. When Maximilian III realized the size of the Ottoman host, the Archduke retreated to Esztergom. What is strange, however, is that, possibly due to his inexperience, Maximilian III did not immediately begin mobilizing the rest of his forces to relieve Eger. It wasn't until October the 4th, nearly 2 weeks later, that the Archduke finally began to take action and make his way towards the border fortress. Mustering what additional forces he could while on the move, Maximilian III also sent word to his commanders to gather their troops and join him in relieving Eger. Additionally, Sigismund Bathory, the Prince of Transylvania, offered his assistance, which the Archduke accepted. Bad weather and poor roads caused even more delays. The constant autumn rain made many of the mountain paths impassable, as the dirt roads turned into thick mud. This made travel exceedingly difficult, especially for a large army with a large baggage train. Both men and animal were left behind in large numbers, either due to fatigue, hunger, disease, or combination of the three. Some sources have suggested that the Archduke may have lost up to a third of his army during this difficult march. Eger's garrison surrendered on October 13th, the siege having lasted just over 3 weeks. In retaliation for Hatvan, the Sultan ordered every captured Austrian to be executed, while sparing the Hungarian units in the garrison. Upon learning that Eger had fallen, Maximilian III held a war council to determine the army's next move. It is here that we should take the time to introduce the leadership of the Allied Christian forces. While Archduke Maximilian III was commander-in-chief, due to his lack of military experience, a council was established to help lead the army. The most experienced commanders were Adolf von Schwarzenberg and Miklos Palffy. Schwarzenberg, a renowned general and field marshal of the Austrian army, was responsible for most of the tactical and strategic planning. Count Palffy led the troops from Royal Hungary and had significant experience in fighting against the Ottoman style of war, having done so all his life. In command of the units from Upper Hungary was Captain Christoph von Tiefenbach. The Transylvanians were led by Prince Sigismund Bathory, with the mercenary captain Albert Karai commanding the prince's largest contingent. It is generally accepted that the Christian force numbered around 40 to 50,000, with 97 cannons. It included troops from all over Europe, with its largest contingent being supplied by Austria, Germany, Royal Hungary, Upper Hungary, Transylvania, and Silesia. Much of the army was equipped with firearms, and at least half of the army was composed of infantry. While the Allies had fewer cannons, these were of higher quality than those of the Ottomans. In addition to their advantage in modern weaponry, the Christian forces had complete supremacy in terms of heavy cavalry as well. After some discussion, the Christian commanders determined the best course of action would be to retake Eger. They assumed that it would likely be too damaged after the recent siege to mount any meaningful defense. They further believed that the terrain around Eger would further prevent the Ottomans from utilizing their superior numbers effectively. However, unsure of what the Ottoman plans were, they agreed to wait near the fields of Keresztes due to its defensible position. The Ottomans, at this point, still did not know the strength of the Allied Christian force opposing them. Given the size of the Sultan's host, he did not take the threat seriously. He detached a force of around 15 to 20,000, consisting of Rumelians, Tatars, and Janissaries, along with 43 cannons, under the command of Jafar Pasha. Jafar Pasha, by many accounts, appears to have been an experienced and reliable commander. It is also worth mentioning that there is still some speculation as to why this force was sent. Some sources state that the Sultan had ordered Jafar Pasha to ambush the Christian camp during the night. This appears to be the most likely. However, it is also suggested that the force may have been sent to gather information about the strength of the opposing Christian army, rather than to confront it. The opposing armies would meet in the fields of the ruined village of Keresztes. To the west of the village lay the Kachi stream, with only 2 points suitable for a crossing, due to the swampy terrain that ran along either side of the stream. The village itself, along with many others in the area, had been destroyed during the siege of Eger. Jafar Pasha, having arrived slightly before the Christians with his army, had already ordered the Rumelian cavalry to cross the stream. He left his Tatar auxiliaries, Janissaries, and cannons in position to support from the opposite bank. In order to further strengthen his position, he had the only bridge in the area dismantled. While the area underneath the bridge was still fordable, it would make any attempt to cross in force much more difficult. The Ottoman commander hoped to use his cavalry to lure the Christian forces into the range of his rifles and artillery. This tactic of feigned retreat had long been the favorite of the Ottomans, very effective against European troops due to their heavy armor. However, having received information gathered by their spies and through interrogating prisoners, the Christian army was aware that a force had been sent against them. Knowing that the Ottoman army was somewhere in the vicinity, they marched in battle formation and were ready for a quick response. Late in the afternoon of October 22nd, 600 forward riders of the Christian army made contact with the Ottoman vanguard near the ruined city of Keresztes. Albert Karai, who was with the Transylvanian vanguard, quickly sent 300 lancers in support. Still heavily outnumbered, however, the forward riders sent for further reinforcements. Schwarzenberg moved quickly, bringing with him around 10,000 Austrian and German riders, in addition to the full Transylvanian vanguard. Palffy followed close behind as well, with a large number of Hungarian hussars. As Schwarzenberg's cavalry were about to engage, the rest of the Christian army also progressed towards the battlefield. The Rumelian cavalry, who had up to this point been holding their own, began to flee. Fortunately for them, the Janissaries were able to cover their retreat, keeping the chasing Austrian and Hungarian riders at bay with rifle fire. The Rumelians, however, did not regroup on the opposite bank, but rather continued to flee from the field. As the Hungarian and Transylvanian infantry began to arrive, a fierce firefight ensued as they exchanged gunfire with the Janissaries across the stream. Up until this point, the Ottomans were yet to activate their artillery. Now, unable to retreat due to the proximity of the Christian forces, they realized that their only hope of surviving was to hold back the Christian tide until sundown. They unleashed their 43 cannons. In response, the Christian light infantry quickly spread out among the ruins of Keresztes and continued to return fire across the stream. Schwarzenberg ordered 6 cannons to be brought up in order to help force the way across the ford. With some artillery support, Albert Karai rallied his troops and again made an attempt to cross, only to be forced back by intense and concentrated Ottoman fire. Due to the narrowness of the ford, it was clear that the Christians will not be able to cross without sustaining extreme casualties. The Transylvanian captain instead decided to look for another suitable point to traverse the stream. He was able to find one further north, bringing with him 800 of the elite blue uniform personal guards of the Transylvanian prince, along with some 500 cavalry. The Transylvanian captain formed his men on a small hill, overlooking the Ottoman left flank. He ordered his troops not to engage until the entire force was in position. When the order was finally given, hundreds of rifles roared into the unsuspecting Ottoman flank, throwing both Janissary infantry and Tatar cavalry into confusion. Looking to further exploit the chaos, the Transylvanian captain ordered his entire force to charge. The Christian cavalry made first contact, driving into the Ottoman ranks, who were still reeling from the initial rifle volley. It was at this point that the Tatar auxiliaries fled, leaving the infantry to their fate. At the same time, the Christian forces on the opposite bank renewed their efforts to force their way across. The pressure was simply too much for the already demoralized Janissaries, having been abandoned by most of their cavalry and now pressed on 2 sides. The resolve of these elite and professional soldiers, the pride of the Ottoman army, finally broke. With the rout of the Janissaries, what remained of the Ottoman force shattered and fled in the wake of the Christian onslaught. The lighter units of Hungarian infantry and cavalry began running down the fleeing Ottomans, only giving up the chase as night fell. The entire confrontation had lasted at most 1 hour. The Ottoman losses during this initial clash were around 500 to 1,000, with all of their 43 cannons captured by their enemy. The Christian losses were negligible, with sources stating around 15 dead, although this figure may be biased. Regardless, it can be gathered that the Christian forces suffered far fewer casualties compared to the Ottomans during this initial encounter. In a report sent to the Sultan before the battle, Jafar Pasha had incorrectly estimated the Christian army to number around 30 to 35,000 strong. It is further mentioned that, upon hearing the size of the opposing army, many of the Ottoman commanders began urging retreat. Jafar Pasha rejected this notion for two reasons, however. Firstly, because his force had up to that point faced few difficulties and had not yet run into any resistance. He thought it would be shameful to return to the Sultan, having accomplished so little. Secondly, he believed that victory was a very real possibility, given the favorable terrain. However, Jafar Pasha had underestimated the Christian commanders, who were highly familiar with the area, having campaigned there for much of the war. While the initial Ottoman plan of luring the Christian army into concentrated rifle and cannon fire was sound, it is evident that they had not expected the initial detachment of riders to hold out for as long as they did. These forward riders had not actually been a part of the Christian vanguard, but were rather sent to find a suitable campground for the main army. The Rumelian cavalry, for whatever reason, were unable to lure their enemy, either possibly due to the cautiousness of the Christian commanders or because of the narrow terrain, which limited their ability to maneuver effectively. Because the Ottomans were unable to rout this forward unit quickly, they allowed for enemy reinforcements to steadily pour in, and eventually for the entire Allied army to appear. It is also possible that the Rumelians were still in the process of crossing the stream when they were engaged by the Christian riders. Either way, their attempts to disengage and feign retreat turned into a genuine rout at the sight of the entire Christian army. It is also important to note that the Rumelian cavalry were simply not equipped for such prolonged close-quarters combat, especially against more heavily armed and armored European-style troops. This initial engagement further showed that while the terrain was highly advantageous to its defender, it did not guarantee success against a numerically superior foe. The Ottomans were also lucky that the confrontation began so late in the day, which helped them minimize the casualties sustained during the rout. However, despite this minor victory, the Allied Christian leadership understood that the Ottomans were far from defeated. The Sultan's main host still stood between them and Eger. Both sides prepared themselves for the massive confrontation that was yet to come. After defeating the Ottoman vanguard during the afternoon of October 22nd of 1596, the Allied army of the Holy League enjoyed an air of confidence, realizing that despite being outnumbered 2-1, they had a very real chance of defeating the massive Ottoman host that invaded their lands. Even so, the Allied commanders were still as cautious as ever. Fearing an ambush, they did not allow their troops to make camp that night. An Italian noble who had fought with the Christian army recounts, "That night everyone stood where they happened to be, and because it was very cold on a field without firewood, we suffered endlessly." During the following morning of October 23rd, the Christian commanders convened a war council. However, notably absent from this meeting was the Prince of Transylvania, Sigismund Bathory. The prince, having set off with his troops before the break of dawn, moved to pursue the defeated Ottoman army and possibly even ambushing the Sultan's main camp. It seems he may have assumed the Allied army would follow him, though this would not be the case, however, as the Allied commanders had ultimately agreed upon a very different course of action. Deciding that the army would maintain its position at Keresztes, they quickly sent messengers to recall the prince. The reasoning of the Allied commanders was as follows. In addition to its highly defensible terrain, the village of Keresztes was also located on the only immediate route into Habsburg Hungary that could support the massive Ottoman army, which would also only be able to approach from the west, as the mountainous terrain to the north and the swamplands to the south were both impassable for an army. If the Sultan wished to continue the offensive, he would be forced to attack the entrenched Christian army on terrain that not only minimized the Ottoman advantage in numbers, but also maximized the Christian advantage in firepower. If the Sultan chose to withdraw from the area, the Allies would be in a strong position to recapture Eger, which had been their original goal to begin with. With this in mind, the Allies were content in allowing the Ottomans to make the first move and react accordingly. A campsite north of Keresztes was eventually designated for the army, and the two major fords of the Kachi stream were fortified with trenches. At the Ottoman camp, Sultan Mehmed was in a panic, shocked by the defeat of his vanguard. During a hastily assembled war council, two proposals were put forth. The first was suggested by the Sultan himself, who wanted to send only the Rumelian army against the Christians. This, however, was strongly opposed by the rest of the council. The second proposal, which was supported unanimously amongst the Ottoman commanders, put forth that under the leadership of the Sultan, the entire army must move to confront the Christians. Faced with strong opposition from the rest of the Ottoman leadership, Sultan Mehmed had no choice but to adapt himself to the will of his commanders. Just as the army was about to set off, however, sources mention that the Sultan considered abandoning his army and returning to Constantinople. It is said that the Sultan had gone as far as attempting to transfer the leadership of the army to his Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha. However, the Grand Vizier was able to dissuade the Sultan from such rash action. Early in the morning of October 24th, the Ottoman host began moving towards Keresztes, leaving behind a force of around 5,000 to garrison Eger. Later that afternoon, the forward elements of the Sultan's army were spotted by a unit of 300 Transylvanian cavalry guarding the southern ford. The Ottoman vanguard, consisting of approximately 10,000, sent forward around 3,000 Tatar cavalry, supported by 6 cannons, in order to probe the Christian lines for any weaknesses. The Tatars spread out along the stream, attempting to cross in small numbers wherever they could. Meanwhile, the rest of the Ottoman vanguard assaulted the Christian fortifications, which had been built around the ruined church of Keresztes. The 300 Transylvanian cavalry who had been guarding the ford were quickly overwhelmed. The Tatars at this point had also managed to cross the stream, finding a small fordable area somewhere further to the south of Keresztes. In total, approximately 5,000 Ottoman cavalry had crossed over to test the Christian defenses. These troops now began making their way towards the Christian camp. The Ottoman cavalry's success would prove to be short-lived, however, as the Allied command had agreed to allow several thousand Ottomans to cross, with the intention of cutting off their retreat once they did so. The Christian trap was first announced with a barrage of devastating cannon fire, which all but stopped the unwitting Ottoman vanguard in its tracks, attempting to return fire with their 6 cannons. This proved ineffective, however, and did not offer any reprieve from the Christian bombardment. Additionally, as the Sultan had elected not to seek battle that day, these units found themselves unsupported by the rest of the Ottoman army, who had instead started to make camp on the other side of the stream. Seeing that the unit was isolated, Sigismund Bathory now gathered his cavalry and charged, and after a brief clash, the Ottoman vanguard was eventually routed, being pursued by the Christians up to the opposite bank. As it was now late in the evening, the Allied commanders chose not to push the attack any further. In their rush to escape, the Ottomans had abandoned their 6 cannons, which were promptly captured by the Transylvanians. This concluded the final actions between the two armies on October 24th. In order to further secure their positions, Albert Karai posted 2,000 cavalry at each of the 2 major fords. As the Ottoman host was so large, its marching formation stretched for miles, with contingents continuing to arrive on the battlefield well into the morning of October 25th. Those unfortunate enough to arrive later in the night or in the early morning were not given the opportunity to make camp, however, and instead were sent immediately to their battle positions. The Christians awoke on the morning of October 25th to the sight of the Ottoman army, assembled and in battle order. It should be noted, however, that the Sultan still had not yet arrived on the battlefield at this time. At around 6 a.m., the Ottomans, taking advantage of their advanced tactical position, were initially able to drive the Christian Guard units from their fortifications before the rest of the Allied army could assemble. Aiming to secure a bridgehead on the Christian bank, the Ottomans additionally sent 4 cannons across the stream in order to further fortify their newly gained positions. The Ottoman vanguard now began to threaten the assembling Christian army, as the outnumbered forward units assigned to guard the crossing were pushed back and forced to give ground. In order to buy more time for the army to assemble, the Allied leaders sent a detachment of 300 cavalry to help stall the Ottoman advance. Additionally, Albert Karai ordered a number of cannons to be brought out from the camp, which began firing upon the densely packed, encroaching Ottoman battle line. The Ottomans returned fire with their 4 cannons, which was mostly ineffective. Unable to withstand the withering fire of the accurate Christian artillery, and in parallel with the previous day's events, the Ottoman vanguard was once again forced back across the stream. This allowed the Christian army enough time to properly form up in their designated battle positions, which is as follows. The army of Upper Hungary, led by Tiefenbach, stood facing the Keresztes ford, its left flank anchored by the fortified church. The Transylvanians, led by Prince Sigismund Bathory and Albert Karai, stood facing southwest, their right flank secured by Tiefenbach's units, who were manning the church fortifications, with their left flank secured by a wagon fort. The northern passage was guarded by the troops of Archduke Maximilian III, who had also left an additional contingent to guard the camp itself. Schwarzenberg, along with most of the German infantry, held the ground between the Christian camp and the ruined village. The Christian artillery was placed behind Tiefenbach's troops, overlooking the crossing at Keresztes. After they were driven back, the Ottoman vanguard again attempted to cross in small groups. It is mentioned that the Tatars launched a fierce attack on the northern passage, which was likely motivated by their desire to plunder the Christian camp. Small groups of Tatars also crossed in the same areas further to the south as the day before. These units also began making their way towards the Christian camp and attempting to circumvent the Transylvanian army opposing them. This was a mistake, however, as the Transylvanians, along with those inside the wagon fort, fired upon the Tatar cavalry, inflicting many casualties and forcing them to withdraw. At around 11 a.m., Sultan Mehmed III, along with the final units of the Ottoman army, finally arrived on the battlefield and took up their positions. While the Sultan's presence was necessary for the morale of the troops, the army was, in practice, led by the Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha. The Ottoman artillery was placed in front of the center division, which was held by the Janissaries, who were flanked on either side by the Sultan's household cavalry units from Constantinople and its surrounding areas. The army deployed according to Ottoman tradition ever since the Battle of Mohacs, with the Rumelians taking up their position on the army's left wing, while the Anatolians took up the right wing. It seems that the Ottoman vanguard, with the Tatar cavalry, were also placed on the right wing and comprised its first line. While we know the positioning of the Ottoman units, the precise formation they utilized is somewhat unclear, although it is suggested that they may have deployed in the shape of a crescent. The battle commenced with an artillery duel. Despite being outgunned, the superior quality of the Christian artillery pieces emerged victorious, inflicting greater losses than their Ottoman counterparts. Realizing this, the Grand Vizier ordered his left wing forward in an attempt to storm the Christian fortifications. This initial attack enjoyed some success, as the Ottoman artillery began targeting the engaged Christian right flank. Looking to further press the attack, Ibrahim Pasha sent forward his Janissaries, and as they emerged from the ford, also began firing into the Christian right flank. The situation became critical for the Christian army, as Tiefenbach's troops struggled desperately to keep the surging Ottoman tide at bay. Seeing this, Albert Karai hurried to the aid of his Hungarian allies, bringing with him the elite blue-uniformed guards of the Transylvanian prince. Schwarzenberg also moved to assist with his own units, and with the combined strength of the three contingents, the Christian allies finally managed to repulse the Ottoman attack. However, as the Ottomans began to retreat back across the ford, 2,000 to 3,000 mixed Transylvanian infantry and cavalry attempted to pursue them, but were quickly driven back by the unengaged Ottoman right flank and sustained heavy casualties. This would conclude the last of the fighting that occurred on October 25th, as the Ottoman army withdrew to their camp for the night. The Christian army maintained its battle positions for some time, and after posting additional guards, eventually followed suit. While the Allies had gotten the better of the Ottomans during the previous engagement of October 22nd and 24th, the fighting on the 25th ultimately ended in a stalemate, mostly due to the extensive casualties suffered by the Transylvanian troops that had attempted to pursue the Ottomans. The two opposing armies prepared themselves for the following day, their leaders drafting extensive battle plans late into the night. Both sides understood that the decisive engagement of the most important battle of their lives would soon begin. Having fought the Ottoman army to a stalemate on October 25th, and with darkness falling, the Christian War Council unanimously agreed upon a plan for the following day. Hoping to replicate the actions of October 24th on a larger scale, they would once again allow the Ottomans to cross the stream. They knew that there would only be enough space for a small portion of the massive army to deploy for battle. The Christians planned to split their army into two battle groups. The first battle group would deploy with its back against the camp, and with the Kachi stream protecting its right flank. In doing so, they would draw the Ottoman army towards the Christian side of the stream, at first allowing several thousand to cross. They would then quickly surge forward and overwhelm these units, whose only avenue of retreat would have been back into their own troops, who would still be in the process of fording the stream. In the ensuing confusion, the task of the second battle group would be to flank around through the northern passage and strike the disorganized Ottoman formation from the side, simultaneously cutting off their retreat. The major encounter had finally come. It is worth mentioning that during the final Allied War Council, the Archduke had suggested that the Christian army would likely have been able to defeat the Ottomans simply by keeping them occupied for a few more days, rather than seek a decisive engagement, believing that the Sultan's host would likely disintegrate on its own. The Austrian Archduke's assessment proved to be correct, as during the same night, the Ottoman leadership realized that they would have to seek a decisive engagement the following day, as their army was exhausted and running low on provisions. However, instead of allowing their troops to rest for the night, the Ottoman commanders instead agreed to attempt a night crossing. Utilizing the smaller fording points found by the Tatars further south, the army spent the entire night and early morning of October 25th and 26th, crossing in small groups and moving into position. Although the Christian army was surprised by the early Ottoman crossing, they were not necessarily caught unprepared. Upon seeing the Ottoman positions, the Allied command made a sudden change in their battle plans, deciding that the army would under no circumstances crossed the stream to pursue the Ottomans, thereby eliminating the need for a second battle group. Under threat of encirclement by the Ottomans, the Christian forward units guarding the ford were quickly recalled and used instead to screen the Allied army as it deployed for battle. The Christian artillery once again proved its worth, as their volleys managed to halt the Ottoman advance altogether. The exact deployment of the Christian army is somewhat unclear and is still debated. An unknown number of cannons were placed on the flanks in front of the main battle line, with both batteries being assigned around 500 infantry each. It appears that the Western Christian infantry, under the command of Schwarzenberg, were divided into 5 tercios and placed in the center of the first line, with Hungarian and Transylvanian light infantry covering the center right and center left, respectively. Placed in between the tercios was a portion of the Transylvanian Hussars, commanded by Sigismund Bathory. The second line, deployed in a wedge formation, was designed to punch straight through the Ottoman ranks. Led by Archduke Maximilian III, it consisted of 4,000 Hungarian Hussars, led by Palffy, their flanks covered by heavy German cavalry, with 1,000 riders on the right and 1,300 on the left. At the back of the wedge were 500 of the most heavily armed and armored knights Europe had to offer. These riders, most of whom were from Westphalia, along with their horses, were covered head to toe in full plate armor. The third and final line was led by Tiefenbach and composed mostly of the remaining Hungarian cavalry and infantry, also including a number of mixed units from other allied nations as well. Around 10,000 troops stayed behind to guard the camp. The deployment of the Ottoman army is also unclear, although we do know that a crescent-shaped formation was adopted. It seems that 24,000 cavalry led by Ibrahim Pasha were placed in the center, with artillery batteries on either side placed in intervals, totaling 109 cannons. In between each interval was a unit of around 2,000 janissaries who stood in squares, as the narrow terrain prevented them from forming a proper battle line. The left and right flanks were occupied by the Anatolian and Rumelian armies respectively. In front of the flanks were the irregular cavalry units, with the Tatars on the front right wing. On the other side of the stream, facing northeast, stood the Sultan with the rest of his Janissary infantry, flanked by cavalry on either side and a few artillery pieces to their front. Additionally, a large contingent of cavalry had been sent to the northern passage, with orders to wait for an opportune moment and attempt to strike the Christian army from the rear. The battle eventually began, with the Christian first line pushing forward under the cover of artillery fire. The flanks of the first line charged ahead and engaged the Ottomans opposite them. However, the Christian right flank, who had enjoyed some initial success, pushed too far and found themselves pressed on two sides as a unit of Janissaries from the Sultan's contingent crossed the stream and joined the fight. Seeing this, Albert Karai, who was positioned on the left flank, renewed his attack, managing to rout the Tatar cavalry in front of him. However, rather than pushing their advantage, the contingent of Sikli guardsmen under his command took to looting the corpses of their enemies. This prompted the routing Tatar cavalry to turn back and charge the unsuspecting infantry. Some units of Tatars attempted to swing around the Christian flank and encircle the infantry in the first line. However, Tiefenbach managed to counter this movement with his own cavalry from the third battle line, eventually routing the Tatars. The Ottomans positioned at the northern passage now also commenced their attack, although were unable to break through the Christian defenses. With both its flanks in danger of being routed, the slow-moving tercios of the first line finally arrived. The Ottoman cavalry opposing them could do little to stop the wall of pikes as they edged forward slowly. Using these moving fortresses as cover, the Hungarian and Transylvanian horsemen of the first line launched lightning strikes against the Ottoman units. The Ottomans were seemingly helpless in the face of the highly trained European army, who, despite being outnumbered on the battlefield, utilized their local superiority to deadly effect. Whenever the Ottoman cavalry threatened to overwhelm the Christian riders, the hussars would quickly withdraw back through the gaps and behind the protection of their infantry. If the Ottoman cavalry withdrew too far away from the tercios, the Christian artillery would target them, and if they came too close, they exposed themselves to both rifle fire and the sudden charges of the Christian cavalry. Unable to endure such abuse, the Ottoman cavalry under Ibrahim Pasha were eventually routed. The Christian center continued to push forward, defeating the remaining Janissary units and capturing all 109 of the Ottoman cannons. Sigismund Bathory then ordered his cavalry to aid the flanks, attacking the Ottomans from the side. Leading some cavalry from the third line, Tiefenbach also came to the aid of the Christian left flank. After some fighting, what remained of the Ottoman left flank were also eventually routed. The seemingly unstoppable Christian advance was finally halted by a unit of Janissaries who had taken up position at the fortified church. The Christian infantry repeatedly attempted to storm the Ottoman positions, but each time were repelled by the Janissaries. The Christians eventually realized that if they wished to dislodge the stubborn Ottomans from their fortifications, they would need more offensive power than the infantry could provide. The Christian second line was finally brought forward. Under the cover of artillery fire, the steel-clad wedge of men and horses drove forward and crashed into the Ottoman positions. Simultaneously, the Christian infantry had taken up position in the nearby ruined houses and now began indiscriminately firing into the Ottoman ranks. Even under the immense pressure of the combined arms of the Christian infantry, cavalry and artillery, the Janissaries clung desperately to their final remaining bridgehead. It was only after a bloody melee that they were finally routed and forced back across the stream. Upon achieving this great success, however, the Christian commanders now faced a dilemma. Despite the Allied leaders having agreed earlier in the morning that under no circumstance would they cross the stream, the Hungarian and Transylvanian commanders now rode to the Archduke's position, calling on him to press the attack. Both Maximilian III and Schwarzenberg were hesitant to do so, not wanting to overextend the army. Sigismund Bathory, Albert Caray, and Count Palffy, all seemingly intoxicated with success, however, continued to pressure the Archduke, arguing that a complete and total victory was theirs for the taking. It was also around this time that the Archduke received an incorrect report that the Sultan had already abandoned his army. With this news, Maximilian III finally relented and agreed to chase the enemy across the stream. The initial Christian attempts to cross were met with stiff Ottoman resistance, the attacks of the German and Transylvanian infantrymen being repulsed multiple times. The Christian artillery was eventually brought forward, and under the cover of cannon and rifle fire, the army was finally able to force its way across. The Allied commanders attempted to reform the army into their previous three-line battle formation. However, this was an incredibly difficult task to accomplish, as not only would the line now have to be rotated a full 90 degrees, but there was also only enough room for two lines. Worst of all, the crossing had not been completed in any organized manner, with the troops of different units being hopelessly intermingled. The army would be exposed to attack as it organized itself, which evidently would take a significant amount of time that the Christians simply did not have. Ibrahim Pasha, having managed to rally a portion of his forces near the northeastern end of the Ottoman camp, saw that the Christian army was in disarray. The Grand Vizier hurriedly ordered his contingent to charge the assembling Christian lines. Lucky for the Christians, however, the Archduke had already managed to reform his cavalry wedge and quickly moved to intercept the incoming Ottoman charge. In the ensuing clash, the more heavily armed and armored European cavalry emerged victorious, the impact of their charge scattering the Ottoman cavalry in all directions. Ibrahim Pasha himself was pushed back to the very walls of the Ottoman camp. Meanwhile, it seems that the other Allied commanders either realized that it would be impossible to organize their troops in a reasonable amount of time, or that they lost control of the troops, who believed that the battle had already been won and were eager for a chance to plunder the Ottoman camp. As they approached the camp, the Christian units were still able to form some semblance of a battle line, albeit extremely disorganized. Their advance was met by around 4,000 Janissaries who had fortified themselves along the eastern entrance of the Ottoman camp and were supported by 4 cannons. Heavily outnumbered, however, this unit was overwhelmed by the charge of the Christian first line of infantry. Unfortunately for the Christians, however, it was here where the front ranks of the Allied army finally lost any semblance of cohesion and discipline, as the army of Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, and Transylvanians devolved into a mob of looters, scattering amongst the tents in search of plunder, with many even discarding their weapons in their eagerness. A group of Christian cavalry also managed to force their way into the Ottoman camp from the north, and without facing any resistance, made their way to the Sultan's tent near the southern end of the Ottoman camp, where they encountered a unit of Janissaries who were still in good order. The Janissaries first discharged their rifles, then drew their swords and fell upon the shocked Christian riders, who began to flee. It was at this point that the supposedly victorious Christian army began to descend into a rout. In their haste to cross the stream and seize what they believed to be an easy victory, and in part due to the clouds of gunpowder smoke in the air which limited visibility, the Christian commanders had failed to recognize that a significant portion of the Ottoman army was still intact. In addition to the troops still fighting, there were still 10,000 unengaged Janissary infantry and a large number of Sipahi cavalry at the southern end of the Ottoman camp. Additionally, the Ottoman reserves and rear guard, along with other rallied units of Tatar and Anatolian cavalry numbering over 25,000, were also still positioned outside and to the south of the camp. Finally, the unit that had been sent to assault the northern passage earlier in the battle had also been recalled and were now within sight of the Ottoman camp. The Sultan, who had at first considered fleeing, was persuaded by one of his advisors to remain with the army and continue fighting. Mehmed III finally took charge, and under his leadership, the remaining fresh units of Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry launched a counterattack. The Sultan also called upon every able-bodied servant and camp follower to take up arms and aid his troops in driving out the Christians from the Ottoman camp. To all those that obeyed, he promised to grant the rank and salary of Sipahi. The now revitalized Ottoman forces quickly began overwhelming the scattered and sometimes unarmed Christian troops, who were in no position to put up any real resistance. Simultaneously, the Ottoman units outside the camp also commenced their attack from both the north and the south. It is worth mentioning that while these attacks occurred nearly at the same time, it appears that this was purely by chance and was not necessarily the result of any planning or coordination between the Ottoman commanders. As the fleeing Christian infantry began emerging from the Ottoman camp, they ran into their own horsemen, who up to this point were still in battle order and were engaged with the returning Ottoman units. The sight of the panicked infantry sowed confusion amongst the Allied cavalry units. As more and more panicked infantry began spilling out of the camp, the Christian riders became unnerved, and soon an unstoppable wave of hysteria swept over the entire Allied army. A few hundred Hussars suddenly broke formation and began to flee, then a few flags of German riders, and within moments nearly the entire Christian army had routed. The Archduke, along with a bodyguard of 300 riders, attempted to stem the mass rout, only to be brushed aside by the sea of panic-stricken troops. Seeing that his efforts were futile, Maximilian III withdrew to the ford, and there again haplessly attempted to rally the army. The only resistance the Ottomans faced as they began running down the Christians was from the contingent of a German prince, Bernard of Anhalt, who unsuccessfully tried to stop the pursuing Ottoman cavalry with 200 Saxon knights. Maximilian III, who by now had accepted that the battle was lost, also attempted to cover the retreating army with the Christian artillery. However, after firing 2 volleys, the artillery crews also abandoned their positions. Many Allied troops were slaughtered by the Ottomans as they attempted to cross the narrow ford, some even drowning as they climbed over one another in desperation. A Transylvanian officer recounts that bodies were piled so high in some places along the stream that one could cross without ever having touched either mud or water. The only saving grace for the Christian army, however, was that the Ottomans, who were likely too exhausted to continue the pursuit, chased the Christian troops only to the edge of the stream. Even with this disastrous rout, modern historians believe that had there been any commander to do so, it would have been possible to rally and reorganize the Allied army within the protection of the fortified Christian camp. However, upon seeing the Allied troops looting their own camp, the Archduke dared not go inside and instead abandoned the battlefield. The only commander to actually have returned to the camp was Count Palfy. However, by the time he arrived at around midnight, the army had already all but disintegrated. Realizing this, the remaining Christian troops admitted defeat, silently gathered their belongings, and returned home. On the Ottoman side, the Sultan at first struggled to regain control of his scattered army, only managing to do so a day after the last of the Christian forces had withdrawn. However, as it was now late October, and with their logistical capacity already stretched to its limit, they were unable to take advantage of the victory. Large amounts of equipment and material was left behind on the battlefield, as the Ottomans were unable to take much with them as they returned home, the rest having been abandoned by the Christians in their haste. The Battle of Keresztes proved to be the Ottomans' last great victory in Central Europe. Having failed to achieve any significant change in the status quo of the region, it seems that the tens of thousands of casualties suffered on both sides were ultimately for nothing. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give us a like, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new around here. Big thanks to our patrons for supporting our work. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.